Now, this is the first car that I will be building that will not be using a Tamiya speed controller. We are going to be using the Hobbywing 1060 that the kit came with. Now, I wasn't too sure I was going to be happy with that because I prefer to use a Tamiya one, and the other thing is, quite often, from what I understand with the leads on the Hobbywing, they don't even fit any of the Tamiya spots where you would normally attach things. Like, for example, you know, the way this is going to attach, if you were using a Tamiya on-off switch, it just attaches to the motor heatsink thing, and you'd be all set. But here's the thing. We've already decided that we are going to be upgrading this kit with the aluminum motor heatsink. So guess what? None of this applies, because I'm not going to be attaching this if I'm attaching that, which means there isn't a spot for the on-off switch anyway. So there's going to be no problem with putting this on, because we're going to have to find a different spot for the on-off switch anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and get the radio equipment all checked out, ready to go. And you can see these are, you know, it's showing you the different screws, what you need to do. But again, I'm not going to show all of that. So the next thing we're going to end up doing is moving to step 27, but I'm just going to get everything checked out. So here we go. Everything's checked out, and the servo and the servo saver are exactly where they need to be. So we can now move on to step 27, which is attaching the servo stay. So I'm just going to grab all the parts that we need and we'll put these on. So here are the parts that we need for this step, and by the looks of it, we need to have those little black pieces right there snapped into this arm right here. So we'll do that first, and then we'll screw that into the servo, and then of course those two servos are going to screw into these brace pieces, which are going to be what holds it to the chassis. So let's go ahead and snap these in first. Okay, so let's snap these guys in. Put one in, grab that. We're just going to push, and that's in place, and you can see that that's going to move around. That's going to move around inside there. We'll do the same with the other side. And then they're moving around in there freely. Create a bit of movement, so that's good. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to screw in the bridge piece right here, and attach it to this piece right here. So we're going to use these MB1 screws, which was the longer ones here. We're going to take one, go through the arm. You can see still some movement. And we're going to grab the bridge. You can see the bridge goes through the center of that, and it's a tapping screw, so we're just going to screw that in. And it's almost there. But you can see that once it's screwed in, there's still movement with the arm just because of the way that piece is. So next step is to screw that arm into now our finished servo with the servo saver. So we're going to grab the other screw, put it in there, and then that's going to screw into the servo saver. Just like that. And so that's how that's going to sit. And you can see there's still movement. So there's a bit of play with this no matter what. But that now, based on what you can see in the diagram, that is how it's going to look. So now what's left is we need to screw these 2 screws in through the servo and into the braces. So when you're doing this, just note the positioning. You'll see that there's a rounded part here, and you can see it's rounded on the top, and you can see that because that's going into the top screw hole on the servo, it's going to go into the top hole on this piece. So just recognize that there's the curve on the top and you're using the top hole. I'm just going to screw those in because that's pretty self-explanatory, and then we'll come back and move on. Okay, so there is the finished servo with the braces that are going to attach this to the chassis. So you can see the curves at the top, and then the bottom, that's how it's going to screw into the chassis. So if you look at the picture, pretty much we're exactly what it should look like. Get that wire out of the way. That's how it's going to look when it's attached to the chassis. So we can move on to step 28, which is attaching the steering servo. And you can see here it says setting up when using a receiver case. I am going to use the receiver case just because I think this car is definitely going to be a runner, and I want to protect it from any of the elements, puddles, waters, mud, etc. So we're going to move on to the setup for that, which you have to go back here to page 19, which is showing you receiver case. So I need to put the receiver into this before we can mess about and attach it into the chassis. So I think we'll go over to this step here and just take a look. So let's look at the positioning of all of this. Here's the receiver case and the openings here. This is obviously our receiver, which is going to go in that way so that the cables are on the left side, and it says you've got to make sure that they're not going to get pinched. Now what I'm finding is if you look at the way this is attached to the receiver, your best option is just to stick with the same direction. So when you're bending it over to here, make sure it's like that, and then with this one, same idea, just make sure that it's actually got the white to the right, because it's also got to go through with the antenna. But if you grab the cover, and if we just make sure that that is correct, I'm just going to bend it down. But I just need to give a little bit of room there to bend that down and that down, just so that it goes in the same way. And I might leave a little bit of extra just to make sure. Okay, holding both those down at the same time so that I can then just grab this and put it on top. And you can see that this isn't pinching. There's a little bit of room, and if I push that through just a bit, and same thing on that side, just push it back a little bit, I know that there's plenty of spacing on the inside. It's not pinching, that's not pinching. This is going to slide through the hole up here for the aerial, and now that is in place. And you can hear, I mean, there's no sound. Like, it showed not to even stick it down with double-sided tape, which was surprising, but there's no movement inside there, so it's fine. And then you've got these 4 screws here, which you're just going to screw in to the 4 corners, which I'll do right now. Or at least get them started, just so that something doesn't shift and the cable comes out. Okay, I'll screw the rest off camera, but that essentially is how that's going to go in to the box. And then once I've screwed this down, you can see that we're going to use the double-sided tape to put it down on the chassis, and the electronic speed controller is now going to sit on top of the servo once we've got the servo in place. So I'll just screw this in, and we're going to move back to step 27. Okay, so moving back to step 27, we've got our servo in place, but of course now we've put everything into the receiver box so that this is all one unit. You've got your electronic speed controller, your receiver in the box, and the servo. So now, when we move on to step 28, we obviously have to install the servo into the chassis, but you can see that this, which would normally be attached, is getting replaced by the aluminum motor heatsink. So we need to work on this and attach that onto the motor. So let's do that now. Okay, so let's open this up now. So there we have the aluminum heatsink, and of course there are some instructions with it. So it's showing you to remove D7, D8, which we never put on anyway, which was the plastic, I guess the plastic heatsink. And then we're going to slide that from the back to the front, and you can actually see they're actually telling you what to do if this was a TT-02 or a TT-01 chassis, how to put on the on-off switch. And of course, with being a hobby wing, this is perfect because we have to change the placement of it anyway. So we'll use some double-sided tape and attach it to the side of the chassis, which is fine. And this, it says attach heatsink so that it does not come in contact with propeller shaft. Well, that pretty much makes sense. So we're going to slide this on. So let's do that. You can see that the way that's shaped, I guess it's going to go on like that with this piece right here at the bottom. And I'm hoping, because what I've realized is we put this in earlier, I am hoping that this is just going to slide on with no problem, which maybe concerns me a little bit. So in actual fact, there isn't a concern. It's just that you have to make sure it slides on in the right position, because it actually naturally fits over. If you kind of move it around as you're sliding it onto the motor, it'll be fine. And you can see that it will move around. It's not solidly attached. And I mean, it says don't get it in way of the propeller shaft. Well, technically it can't, because that piece right there, which was the plastic housing before it goes down, you can see that there's no way that it's even going to go near the shaft. But it will move around. You can see on the bottom that all it's doing is wrapping around the motor. So I'll click it in, and I'll probably leave it, I'm going to guess I'm going to leave it right like that so that the marking is just above where you can see the torque tuned. Leave a bit of a gap, I suppose. And I'm just going to leave it like that. It's interesting because there's nothing to hold it down. Like, that is it. It just slides onto the motor. There's nothing else in the bag. That was it. So it just sits there. Now, it can slide a little bit that way. And again, it's not going to go anywhere. It cannot interfere with the drive shaft. Part of that is probably because I've replaced this with the aluminum drive shaft setup. If it was the plastic one that it comes with the kit, I think it might be a problem. But like I said, I'm going to leave it like that. So we can move on to installing the servo into the chassis. But one last thing before I move on, you'll notice here that it says it is only for use with Type 540 motors, RS 540 sport tuned, or RS 540 torque tuned. Never use it with any of these others below, as motor terminals will come in contact with the heatsink and cause a short circuit. So technically, this motor mount really, or the motor heatsink, is really only used for their versions of the 540 motor, which is interesting. I don't know whether that makes a difference to all of you out there, but now even for me, I know that it can only be used with their 540 series. So let's move on and let's attach the servo to the chassis. So we're going to attach this to the chassis, and we're going to use these screws. And of course, we've made some changes because obviously the receiver is in the receiver box. So one of the things that I have done is I've gone through this and unwound this as much as possible so that this isn't actually twisted. So for example, like if it was this way, it's going to be all wrapped. So I've untwisted it so that it's as untwisted as possible at this point before it's installed, so that it's not going to get mixed up with everything else. So what we're going to do now is take those two screws, and you can see that there are two on the back side right here, and they are going to go into the bottom of these two pieces that we put on earlier. So this is going to end up sitting here, and then that will end up sitting there, and of course we're going to end up screwing it into the steering rack. But first, let's get this in place. And we know that, whoops, that's there. So we just got to find that spot. There it is. And let's do the first one. I'm not going to tighten it yet, but they are tapping screws. I just want to get a feel for it first. I'll grab the other one, make sure it's lined up. Make sure that hole is there. There it is. There we go. Okay, it's not pulling much, but I just want to make sure that it's there. And then that's fine for placement. Okay. So we're going to be able to actually screw this in now. Okay, so that is now in place, and what we're going to need to do is grab the other two screws, the MB4s, with some grease, and we're going to end up attaching it to the rack. So I'll grab those screws and we'll grease them up. Okay, so let's grease this up a bit, because it sounds like we need to grease up this screw. Because it's a moving part, that's pretty much why this is needed. Because everything's going to be moving around it. And we're going to... let's take this screw, put it into that hole and into that rack. And that's fitting, so oops, okay. Now just gonna wipe that down a bit, and we'll do the same for the other screw. Probably more on there than's needed really, but now we'll take that into that one and into there, yes. And we'll screw that down. Okay, so there we go. That is now screwed down, so you can see that this is now all solid. I'm gonna have to do some fine tuning just to make sure that these are level, but you can see that you've got the full rack built. It attaches to this, and then this is attached to the servo. So that is done. So now it's just a matter of now fitting in that receiver box into this space here, which I'll just check it all out first and then we'll put that in. So for the next step, because we have put the receiver into the receiver box, we're going to need to put double-sided tape here and then slide this in and put it in place. Now, because this is going to be a little hard to do on with the camera in front of me, I'm just going to put this in and I'll come back after it's done. Because I need to make sure that after I've put the double-sided tape in, that this is perfectly level, or you know, as centered as it possibly can be. But I can't do that with the camera there. So I'll just do that and then we'll be back. Okay, so I've got the receiver box in place. It is down with the double-sided tape. It kind of slipped a little. You can see that it's not perfectly perpendicular to the chassis. It doesn't matter, but it got caught on the way in, and I just decided it's okay. I mean, as a whole, you know, it's fine. Slightly tilted. It might be a mine. It's gonna bug me a little bit, but it's okay. I'm not gonna pull it out. It's fine. But if we move on, you can see that for step 29, it's attaching the RC unit. But because and you can see that the receiver was to go on top of the servo, the electronic speed controller went there. But as before, because we are using the receiver case goes there, and the electronic speed controller sits on top of the servo. So I will now get some double-sided tape, and we're going to attach this to the top of the servo, and it's going to face that way because this is obviously the lead to the battery. Those are the leads to the motor, so the placement is correct, being right where it is. And once that's all double-sided tape down, I'll then be able to move these things around. But what I've decided also is, look how short the lead is on the 1060 Hobbywing speed controller. So what I'm going to do is we're going to take the lead, and I'm actually just going to attach it to the top of the box just like that, and again with some double-sided tape. So you can see on this side, you can see the on-off. It's just going to sit there on top of the box like that. So ultimately it should just look like that when it's complete. So I'm just going to install that and probably move, use some of the tie down straps to move some of these cables, and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so it's all attached. We've got our speed controller down, we've got our on-off switch down, and these cables, they're showing that you need to use one of the tie down straps to you know, clean it up, which I will do. However, depending, I may have made a slight mistake in that everything I'm doing for the kit is exactly how it's supposed to be. But obviously we're going to have police lights on this and possibly police sound, which requires me to get back in the box to plug into the accessory spots on the receiver. So I'm not going to tie this down yet. I think I'm going to have to wait until I'm fully ready with the lights, the body, etc. before we can do that. So I'm just going to leave that alone for now. So we can move on to step 30, which is attaching the tires to the wheels.